light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. A number of years ago, I created a weekend workshop that so far no one's ever asked me to actually do, but it was suggested to me that I should find some way of offering something that might contribute to Sister Who's work ultimately becoming financially self-supporting. So I thought, how about a weekend workshop? Well, I started out life in the Roman Catholic Church, and so I was surrounded by ritual and stained glass windows and pipe organs and so forth during times of worship or spiritual focus. And I still think that those environments had the greatest sense of reverence that I think I've ever experienced. It was really quite an amazing experience, and really had nothing to do with the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. I never really had much use for them, so I pretty much ignored them, and they pretty much ignored me, so I guess the feeling was mutual. But in any case, my point, the weekend workshop I created, I entitled Rediscovering Ritual and Making It Personal. And the basic point of the workshop was coming to an understanding of how ritual can be this way of acting out whatever beliefs one has. And years later, after growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, and before I designed this workshop, I also met and developed friendships and familiarity with lots of neo-pagan worship practices and spiritual practices. And of course there were Buddhist practices and all sorts of other different possibilities that I encountered along the way. All of which made it horrendously disappointing for me in theological school when I enrolled in a course entitled Ritual and Worship, and I thought, oh, now we get to the good stuff. And then I discovered that the professor was only familiar with Anglican ritual and worship, whereas my understanding of ritual and worship extended from Roman Catholicism on Christmas Eve, midnight mass, to neo-pagan circle casting and such. And with that broader spectrum, it was after that I created this workshop, and I said, people need to be able to create their own rituals. And, that whatever transition or challenge or whatever it is you're facing in life, to have some way of bringing that into your spiritual practice and acting it out, because there is something about acting it out and hearing yourself say it or sing it or whatever expression you want to use that allows that processing those difficult emotions or processing that milestone in your life in a way that makes it more powerful and more meaningful than ever, than it would have otherwise been. And so there was one ritual I attended once that I thought was brilliant. It's the only one like this I've ever heard of occurring, actually. And that was a young couple who had been married for several years and decided that they were now going to get divorced because their lives were moving in different directions, and they didn't want to limit each other. And so they called all their friends together and had this big circle gathering where they recognized each other, they gave thanks for what they had shared, and then they released each other. And the whole evening culminated in taking a vine from that had been placed in a vase on the, I guess you'd call it, altar table in the center, and cutting the vine in two and putting the two pieces into two separate vases on each side, so that each of them could take the start of a houseplant home with them into their respective lives as they moved in different directions and explored other possibilities of where their life could go and what they could become. And it was such a positive affirmation of of doing divorce in a distinctly positive, liberating, empowering way. And on one hand, I think people need to take marriage much more seriously before they dive into it, and take divorce much more seriously before embracing that, as saying, no, we can't do this, we have to give up. Maybe you have to give up and maybe you don't, and maybe nobody should decide but you. Whatever you decide, if you're going to stay together, it's going to take work. All good relationships do. If you're going to separate, make it as positive and empowering as possible, because it will leave you with less emotional baggage to resolve afterward. So the more you can say, thank you, but we need to separate now, and to do it in a civil, contented, peaceful sort of manner. And yet it's understandable if there are tears, and if a week later you're thinking, my God, what have I done? But life and time, of course, always goes forward. And so once the choice has been made, one has to commit to that choice and to bringing out the best in it that they possibly can. But as I was creating this workshop on rediscovering ritual and making it personal, it's things like what that young couple did, of how can we illustrate with a ritual our separation in a way that is distinctly positive. A lot of that has to do with looking at objects and things. It's kind of the same thing. Objects and things around us, objects, dynamics, anything around us. It could be literally anything. And asking, what could this symbolize? It's not that everything has to symbolize anything. It's not that everything has to symbolize something, but absolutely anything could symbolize something. And in the Catholic Church, there was an understanding as I was growing up of sacramental objects, that objects that were used in rituals or sacraments, that a chalice or a bell or a sort of scarf called a stole that hung around the shoulders of the minister. Spreading incense down the aisle was viewed as a sort of spiritual cleansing. All sorts of different activities that in and of themselves are nothing. Where they become sacramental is when we assign them a meaning that comes from us, that doesn't come from the object itself. And so if meaning can be assigned, then that's a dynamic that can be constructively utilized. And so in the same way as that young couple, that they assigned a meaning to the plant, that in the same way that the plant was cut and there was a moment of cutting, but the two plants now could go and grow into bigger, flourishing, ongoing plants. It wasn't the end, it was a transition, perhaps momentarily painful, perhaps not. I suppose it depends on debating, do plants feel pain? I'm inclined to think they do, but maybe not in the same way that we do. But either way, the plant's life was not terminated. It was a transition point. Every ritual in every Roman Catholic or Neo-Pagan or Episcopalian or any other kind of service I've ever been in, every ritual was always a transition point. There was a before and there was an after. The question was whether in that after I had gone through, or I had experienced a constructive change. Ideally, all rituals, in my humble opinion anyway, all rituals should empower or embody constructive change. The point of having a ritual is to take something that is challenging or perhaps even negative, and through that ritual to transform it into a positive transition. Even if it's not necessarily negative, if it's a rite of passage, if there is something about doing the ritual that empowers it for greater subsequent meaning or activity. I suppose To use a more secular ritual, one could look at the ritual of attending a high school graduation, or not attending, but being one, participating in one's high school graduation. That after 4 years of frustration and struggle and accomplishments and a mix of everything that life can possibly include, sometimes with astonishing intensity, there is this ceremony, and one's name is called, and in my case, my name was called. I went up to the podium. I received a diploma from an administrator, and I walked off the platform again, and that was the ritual signifying the end of the closure and the conclusion of my high school education, which was to be followed by taking that diploma and going out into the world and seeing what I could do with it, what I could do with everything I had learned. It was a turning point. It was a milestone, something that marked a distinction, a point of transition between the past and the future, and was experienced at the time as a present moment. That's what rituals can do. And the more we begin to look at objects and, to look at basic objects even, and to say, well, it's a chair. Is it just any chair? Well, it's the chair that I was sitting in when I got the news about. Well, then it could be a symbol of coming to terms with how difficult or wonderful or whatever that news was. If it was wonderful news and we want to celebrate it, have a cake with candles or whatever and set it on the chair and dance around the chair, and that becomes your ritual of really, really celebrating and totally immersing yourself in how wonderful that news was. And if it was the chair you were sitting in when you got really sad news, well, that could be where, if, for example, the news was the loss of a loved one, that could be the chair upon which you set a photograph and which becomes the altar of sorts for memorial service for that person. Ordinary mundane objects being transformed into spiritual tools in order to facilitate dealing with emotions and thoughts and the progression of one's life. The piece of paper I received at my high school diploma in no way validated 4 years of experience. It was simply a piece of paper given to me by an administration, validating an accomplishment in a sense and giving me something I could show to people who want to know whether or not I passed all my classes or whether I failed too many classes or what. This is a piece of paper, a certification, but in the truest sense of the word, it did not validate 4 years of life. The same with my subsequent degrees. When I seriously considered not going to my college graduation because I really didn't think anything I could receive from that administration would validate the 4 years of struggle and heartache and pain and dealing with so much craziness that I had to put up with during my undergraduate education. It was a very repressive administration, actually, and I don't think they really ever understood who I was or what I was dealing with, and I'm not sure if they really cared. And so the notion of receiving a validation from them somehow seemed very phony, and like it would almost be insulting that they would put themselves in the position of validating my experience when they did absolutely nothing to protect me or to help me through the worst parts of that experience. And in fact, some of the worst parts of that experience were their fault. And which I say that not because I don't want to take responsibility, but because it was the result of their actions. They're the ones who did it, objectively speaking. The real validation of me getting my undergraduate degree, a BA in humanities, was that all of the things that had been thrown at me had not succeeded in preventing that. There was a poster I saw somewhere a little while back I think it was something to the effect that a scar is is something to be proud of, because it means that whatever tried to kill you failed. Something that I'm saying it very badly, but it was basically that there are things that we survive, and we do wind up with scars and injuries and all sorts of things from that, but the fact that we did survive means that we were stronger than the thing that attacked us. We were stronger, we won, we got through it. But it's because of the way human beings are situated within time, and we're always staying too close to our present moment. It puts us in this difficult place of not knowing that graduation day is coming. We've been told, we think it's out there, but there were people in my high school who never made it to graduation because of being killed in car accidents or any number of other things. There were some of them who gave up too early and then decided to go join the military because there was nothing else for them to do, because no one would hire them without a high school diploma, but the military had no such scruples. And each one has to make the choices that ultimately become the progression of developments in their life. I do my best to respect those choices. And yet sometimes other people's choices give me painful emotion to deal with. My parents made the choice that they did not want an openly gay person in their lives. And so, trying to figure out what does it mean in practice, the biblical injunction to respect your parents. Well, how do you respect someone who's totally rejected you? And so the only thing I was really able to come up with is that I would respect their choice and stay away. And I don't expect to ever see them again, but I told them, if you ever get to the point where where you think you're ready to integrate an openly gay person into your lives, please call me. And they just assured me that that would never happen. And I said, well, I need to go on with my life. I need to do the most good that I can do. I need to be the most forgiving and loving and wise person that I can possibly become. And so that's what I've done ever since. It does leave me with some difficult, painful moments each year, though, especially at Christmas time, when there is no family with whom to celebrate Christmas. And so part of what I did in trying to bring rediscovering ritual and making it personal, applying that to my own life, there were things that I was painfully denied in childhood that had meaning to me that my parents never understood. And so there were a number of years where I took that list of things that I had been denied, and that's what I gave myself, something off that list is what I gave myself for Christmas that year. And as I unwrapped it, knowing what it was because I was the one who wrapped it, saying prayers and saying affirmations, and that, for example, one of those things was a CB radio, a Citizens Band radio, which I wanted at a time in my early teens when I felt extremely lonely, and it seemed to promise having friends and social connections outside of my family, outside of the environment that had so ostracized me. And so to me, the CB radio became a symbol, if you will, of community, or of potential community. And my parents understood that it meant a very great amount to me, but didn't want to spend the money. And so what I got under the Christmas tree that year in my early teens was a box about the right size, all wrapped up, and on top of the box was written in my mother's handwriting, "Here's your CB." And inside the box, in amongst all this newspaper, was a chicken bone. And I was devastated and never asked for anything from my parents ever again, but they thought it was very funny. But in bringing this whole constructive use of ritual to my present life, there was a particular year, a number of years ago, where I bought and wrapped up a CB radio and put it under the Christmas tree. And as I was unwrapping it, saying affirmations such as, specifically so that there will never again be a chicken bone Christmas, that there will never again be a Christmas where all one experiences is disappointment, and in a devastating way. That Christmas will somehow be transformed by the ritual I was doing into something that even I, as a single individual, can celebrate each and every Christmas by giving me things I was denied, by giving myself things that specifically empower me in whatever dream I'm pursuing, in whatever is valuable and beautiful to me, whatever puts a smile on my face, specifically making an extra effort to give those things to myself at Christmas time. Not in a narcissistic way, but in a way that is totally oriented around healing whatever pain is still remembered. This is one of the downsides, I guess, of having autism, is that for especially emotionally charged events, I have a phenomenal memory, and I remember days when I was 7 years old, like it was yesterday, overhearing my parents complain to other parents that they weren't sure whether I was ever going to talk, and then when I started talking, they weren't sure whether I was ever going to shut up, because I went from talking very late to being the little professor, and wound up reading full-length novels by the time I was in third grade. And the problem with that, and I guess it's a somewhat common experience for parents of children with autism, is that the autistic child will sometimes fixate on a particular collection or subject and become a walking database for that subject, and all you have to do is mention it and they will go on for hours talking about every single different kind of dinosaur, what its name was, how big it was, what era within which it lived, whether it was a meat eater or a plant eater, everything that you didn't need to know about dinosaurs, and this child knows it. In my case, it was the Knights of the Round Table. At one time in third grade, I could name every single one of them, and knew all the stories, and even found the book that explained how Robin Hood died, and all sorts of folk tales and literature like that was fascinating to me. But most other people weren't terribly interested in it and didn't support or encourage that interest at all. So in all of those odd sorts of things, I guess, you never know what life will throw at you. And how will we make sense of it? And how will we come to terms with it? And find a positive way to move through even the most painful and difficult moments. Not in a blind, allegedly Pollyanna sort of way, but when I watched the original Disney movie called Pollyanna, it was not at all like that. She was a very grounded and intelligent young lady who found ways to respond to the hard edges of life in a way that allowed her to transform them into stepping stones, out of which she could build a stairway. Instead of stones that weighed her down, they became stepping stones that she could stand on that would lift her higher. And the more stones, if you're deep in a hole and people keep throwing stones at you, keep making a pile of them in the center, and eventually that pile of stones will be high enough that you'll be able to step out of the hole. supported by all of the negative things that people threw at you, that you have found ways to transform into stones that you could stand on. I don't mean to keep repeating myself as I'm saying that, because it's like I'm talking in circles, but it takes effort. I mean, that's the other part that you have to remember about that. The stones are not going to make a pile on their own. You have to do that. And the rituals are not going to happen on their own. You have to approach them with intention and ingenuity and honesty, and embrace them, and with your intention specifically make something positive come out of it. The negative that's thrown at you, the pain that is thrown at you, the disappointment that is thrown at you, the ways that one is ostracized or marginalized, all that stuff comes at you, and it doesn't have to be the final word, because within every human heart, I really believe there is strength and vision and possibility that is yet untapped. If only we will find the ways and be stubborn enough to keep looking until we can bring it out into the light and make it something that serves a purpose no one else imagined it could ever serve, but it serves a purpose that makes the positive difference.